The Pantheon of Kislev is not unlike that of their brothers to the west, the Empire. With only 3 chief cults, Kislev worships idols that are centered around portions of their culture and geographical surrounding. Fire, thunder, and, well, bears are the 3 arenas that the cults of Kislev take part in. In today's video, we're going to discuss the cults of Dazh, Ursun, and Tor, the gods that make up the Kislev Pantheon. This will all lead into our wide sweeping Kislev lore video coming out later this week that will cover their entire history, their culture, and their units as a whole. To start out, it would be unfair to say that the people of Kislev are any more or less pious than those of the Empire. By Sigma is a common exclamation we hear throughout the people of the Reich. In fact, the Empire has a much larger pantheon. And it's worth noting that all 3 major hubs of humanity, the border princes, including Antilia, Kislev, and the Empire, all have cults of each other's societies within their borders. So nothing is mutually exclusive, and there's always a kind of loose alliance that extends between the peoples at any one time. Kislev, though, as we know, is a frigid land of ice and frost, stretches far to the north and east over the World's Edge Mountains. There's a great deal of cultural differences from the Cossacks to the Ungals to the native Kislevites and more, really, and we'll talk about that more when we go into our video on the culture. But what really brings these people together is their many cults. So let's dive in on some of these, and we'll start with my favorite, Father Bear, as he's called. The Cult of Ursin is actually pretty similar to the Cult of Ulrich in the Empire. The two actually have a kind of a long-running feud that's less about outright hostility and more about kind of friendly animosity. Ulrich is the god of wolves and winter, and Ursin is the god of bears. And also pretty much winter, but not actually, but pretty damn close. And this could be argued for the chief or state religion of Kislev. I mean, it's really is the patron religion, I guess. Ursun is the patron god. And, I mean, Boris Ursus really kind of caused a resurgence of this religion during his reign, and the subsequent reign of his daughter, Katerine, which we are currently in, right? That's the current timeline of the world as it is. But Ursun himself is seen as this sort of gigantic brown bear, or if he's in human form, he's this monstrous man with a great big bushy beard and a long brown hair with these kind of gray streaks running through it. Very much a wild man kind of imagery. And Ursun has this disposition that is really not unlike that of Kislev as a whole. And really, it's where you sort of see that they get this kind of heavy influence from, that kind of rub dirt in it attitude of just kind of always pushing forward. And Ursun is this grim figure that is not without passion, really, but he is definitely a, fend for yourself type of idol that encourages self-sufficiency, perseverance, and courage above all else. And this is what makes up the touchstone of the Kislev culture. I'm sure there's priests of Ursun, and they worship him and they pray to him and everything like that. But it's said in the lore that Ursun is more likely to give his favor to someone fighting in battle courageously to better himself or to persevere than he is to a priest who's in a shrine or temple praying to him. So it's interesting. So that culture, though, the culture of Kislev, is a culture that's constantly beset by chaos on all sides, and Dolgans, we'll read those as Kurgans if you want. And they're a stalwart folk, they're used to that sort of lasting until the bitter end, come hell or high water type approach to life. I like to compare them to kind of like a World War II Soviet Red Army, but we'll go into that more when we talk about the actual army roster itself. Getting back to the religion, the cult doesn't really have temples or conventional holy places like you see a lot in the other religions across the Warhammer world. Instead, the priests kind of hold prayers in old bear caves or any number of outdoor shrines, the greatest of which actually resides near the Bokar Palace, where a giant grove of pine trees, rocks, small caves, and even bears roam. You can't tell, there's a lot of veneration towards bears. Actually brings up another great point here, is that that obvious veneration towards bears kind of comes without saying. It kind of goes without saying, right? But we've talked about Kislevites hunting bears, even wearing bear pelts and whatnot. Well, Ursun himself loves 2 things: bears first, duh, and followed closely by humans. And he kind of granted humans the privilege to hunt bears, not the right, so long as they go about it respectfully and as a means to survive. This kind of sort of harkens to the Native American culture's veneration of animals that they hunt, buffalo, wolves, etc. Native American, obviously, here in the US, and the mentality of not wasting anything in a hunted animal. And it's somewhat similar to Kislev, hunting bears with this kind of veneration and respect. Now, of course, if someone were to, say, disrespect the corpse of a bear or break some of the other tenets of the cult, they might find a rampaging, mad, gigantic bear trampling through their town, taking the offender out of their bed and being eaten alive in the middle of the street. Like I said, Ursin is a kind god, but not one to be trifled with. There was a point in the history of Kislev where the kind of worship of the cult of Ursin was at an all-time low, kind of like attacked. The great chaos invasion and the multitude of kind of Kurgan invasions, funny how that sounds, right? Kurgan incursions, I guess, had kind of fractured a good deal of Kislev, resulting in most of the shrines abandoned or destroyed. Kurgans pretty much controlled a lot, the Dolgans controlled a lot of northern Kislev at one point in their culture. So we talk about Total War Warhammer 3 and what kind of campaign that will look like, well, taking back that Dolgan occupation, I guess you could say. And Boris Ursus really took up the mantle of High Priest of Ursin for the first time in 300 years, thus kind of restoring the cult to its former glory. Every stanista, as it's called, or town, has a priest of Ursin somewhere within it. And it's also worth noting here that by doing this, he helped cement the cult in the upper echelons of the Kislevite society, kind of ensuring that the high-ranking caste, the oblast, continue the worship of the mighty naked bear god, Father Bear. And to signify yourself as a worshiper of Ursun, the devout typically have a bear's paw talisman or like a bearskin cloak, or in the more rare cases, in the more northern regions, where the northern regions of Kislev are a little bit more, it's not rural, but they're more isolated because there's a further distance between towns, and it's way more just bombarded with absolute bitter frosty cold, right? So in the more rare cases in the north, you have actual bear skulls that they wear on their heads, which actually, that brings us over to our next point. Well, I want to talk about here. Earlier, we did talk about breaking, the rules of the cult. So let's go over some of those rules, right? Every cult has a set of strictures, is what they're called, in which you cannot break. And this is from the Warhammer Fantasy RPG, in which if you chose to follow a cult, and this extends to the Empire cult as well, and you broke any of these strictures, it would actually have an effect on your character, which is actually pretty cool. You think about paladins in Dungeons and Dragons. If you fall away from lawful good, you lose your paladin abilities, and it's kind of, you could become this fallen paladin. It's not exactly like that, but there are penalties for breaking strictures. So let's talk about the strictures for Ursin, and we will subsequently talk about them for every god. But Ursin has got never hunt a bear in the winter, let him sleep, which I feel like that's the way we treat our dads, right? Let dad sleep, don't go smack him on the forehead. Bears must always be killed by hand or arrow. No dogs or traps, so basically no skullduggery when it comes to killing bears. Only wear the skin, claw, or skull of a bear you have killed. So like the devout worshippers, the paw, the bear pelt, or the skull, right? So those are the only three things that you can wear, and you yourself have killed. So you can't like wear your dad's skull, not his skull, the bear skull that he passed down to you or something like that. That's something that's got to go on a mantle. You don't wear that. That's not something you're supposed to wear. It's only something that you yourself will wear. That's how you respect the bear that you've killed. Eat fish at least once per week, but never eat fish and other meat on the same day, which kind of feels like a general good health diet right there. And never perform your ablutions indoors. So, don't bathe yourself indoors. So interesting, right? A lot of kind of interesting little rules for Ursin. And Ursin has some pretty modest rules. We'll talk about Dazh, who has, again, pretty modest rules as well, and Tor has just one rule. So it's pretty interesting how these gods have these different rules that kind of pertain to them, and how that plays into their worship. Now, our last note on the Cult of Ursun is the divine lore of Ursin. And they're these spells that have really gone the way of the dinosaur. I mean, they're not used in anything. There's not in any edition of Warhammer. They're only in Warhammer Fantasy. And they're primarily just fluff for the purposes, but for Total War Warhammer 3, I'd love to see Kislev have some special lores. If you think about it, the Demons of Chaos will have access to the lore of Nurgle, the lore of Tzeentch, the lore of Slaanesh. So, alternatively, I'd love to see the lore of Ice, a given and absolute must for Kislev, but also lores dedicated to the three gods, Ursin, Tor, and Dazh. And Ursin's lore deals primarily with buffing the user or his party members, read units if you want to compute it to Total War Warhammer, or putting enemy units to sleep. Like he puts a bear to sleep so that you can like talk to it and shit. It's really weird. So not a huge application to the greater Total War battlefield, but it would be a really nice sprinkle of flavor nonetheless, because I'm sure that Creative Assembly is more than capable of kind of making this a custom lore for the game. But having talked about the father of bears, let's talk about our next god, who is basically like a Kislev Captain Jack Sparrow, Dazh, the god of fire and the sun, which you can imagine would be pretty important in a land completely ice-capped with snow. If Ursun's holy day falls on the spring equinox, when the snows begin to melt, then Daz's holy day is actually on the opposite end of the spectrum. Kislevites offer a great deal of homage to Dazh, right as the first snows begin to fall, kind of ensuring that the winter will be more forgiving, and well, I guess you can at least hope that it's more forgiving. But they do. His holy day is also at the end of winter as well, to hope that a good sun comes to give proper sun to the crops and everything like that. Kislev is not entirely covered in snow. There are portions of it that are thriving croplands and harvest and everything like that. It is not entirely just this desolate wasteland. But Dazh has a history rooted at the beginning of time, when man had nothing but ice and perpetual night. In a nod to the Grecian Apollo, Dazh rode his fiery horse from his fiery palace across the night sky, bringing day for the first time. And every night he rested before being able to do it again. And eventually, because he was afraid for man during the night, he didn't want them to get cold and die off, he brought the gift of fire to man, allowing them to stay warm in the cold, frigid night. And Dazh is kind of incredibly important to the dichotomy of the three religions of Kislev. He's seen as the far nicer of the three, and more of a prince than a rural rustic man as you see with the other two. As thus, the religion is heavily formalized, and his followers put proper manners and kind of respect tantamount to man's welfare. While every town might have a priest of Ursin in it, every house has a symbol to Dazh. So you definitely understand that Dazh, while not as widespread as Ursin as far as the chief religion goes, he is definitely extremely important to the culture of Kislev because, well, the sun and fire, that kind of ensures that everyone in Kislev doesn't turn into one of those like triple flavor popsicles that turns your mouth like a host of different colors. Whatever. But it really depends on what part of Kislev you're in. His worship is far different in the north versus the south. And you're going to see this a lot as we talk about Kislev culture. The northern culture is a lot different than the southern culture. The southern culture is going to be a little bit more civilized / more like the empire, whereas the northern culture is a little bit more like the tried and true Kislev roots. So the north sees the worship of Dazh as a matter of life or death. With much longer, darker, and colder nights, the north will take any help it can get. And some towns might find themselves so lucky as to be visited by the Arari, or Firebirds, which is not a now defunct sports car from Pontiac, but rather the messenger of Dazh himself that brings a kind of reprieve in dark times. Usually has some sort of good news, or even brings some sun. But the South, however, their worship of Dazh is much more about welfare and the common good of man. So what's interesting is that Dazh kind of borrows so many traits from Apollo, right? He's this dashing, young, princely figure with long, flowing hair, kind of glowing eyes, and a very regal and proper coat, like Jack Sparrow, but not really. Jack Sparrow can have like glowing eyes, more like seedy eyes. But again, very Apollo-esque, because Apollo has this very statuesque, pinnacle look of a warrior, and at the time, that's very sought after and very, very venerated in Grecian society. So again, kind of a great parallel. Even his actions in the mythos are pretty much in line. The priesthood, though, is more in line with, say, Catholicism, how rigid and how formalized it is. And it's that kind of formalized approach to both worship and mass. And the biggest holdup, I guess you could say, between Dazh and, I guess, because every single pantheon has got a kind of like a, not pantheon, every single god is like a little bit of like a tizzy with another god. We talked about Ursin and Ulrich, and actually that's Dazh's thing too. The Dazh and Ulrich, Dazh being, the god of fire and the sun, hell, his chief holy day is the summer solstice, whereas Ulrich is the god of winter. So, on opposite ends of the spectrum, but again, no outright hostility here. This is still the human pantheon overall. These are not completely unheard of in each other's lands. But kind of a differing of opinion is more of what it is. In fact, Dazh doesn't really concern himself with Ulrich because he considers himself, he considers the sky his realm versus Ulrich's realm being the ground, I guess you could say. He kind of holds himself as a bit of a loftier character. He's very princely in his approach and sometimes kind of sees himself above the common man. But needless to say, Dazh does have a set of strictures that he follows, much like the Cult of Ursa. And these are a bit more interesting, though, and they kind of speak very much to the whole proper manners, welfare of man, etc. So, here you go. You've got always offer hospitality, even to strangers and enemies. Never let a fire go out during the night. Man, that's difficult. Like, I mean, you ever gone camping? That thing just kind of goes out on its own. You're supposed to put it out, too. It's how you fight forest fires. Never set a fire on a dirty hearth. Never want that. And then offer prayers to Dazh on the first morning that the winter snows cover the ground. So you can see here, right? A lot of these have to do with kind of proper manners, proper ways to do things, and so on and so forth. Now, lastly, we'll briefly talk about the magic associated with Dazh. And as you could have guessed, it's a lot of fire-based attacks or means of warming yourself or your party in the Warhammer RPG. It's actually pretty similar to the lore of fire as a whole, but there's one ability, Sacred Guest, which I think is kind of fun. Essentially, the lore dictates that the spell, when cast, blessed your time as a guest of someone's home, which is kind of fun and goofy in and of itself. But if the guest, for any reason, forsakes the blessing, they become cursed, which could include, and I quote, fires failing to light, fires giving no heat, or fuel burning at quadruple rate. The curse lasts until the host apologizes to you or prays for forgiveness at a temple of Dazh. So you can see a pretty different outlook compared to Ursin. Dazh is still a Kislevite god at the end of the day, so he does have a measure of shrewdness about him. The lore talks about him sometimes being too busy to answer prayers, whereas Ursin kind of seemingly doles out his blessing a bit more often to the merit of those that worship. Criteria for Ursin and whatnot. But we do have one more god to talk about, so let's talk about the mighty Tor. And you'll be surprised to find that he is the god of lightning and thunder, because Games Workshop is absolutely known for their ability to come up with overly original lore. Said no one ever. Now, Tor doesn't really have as robust, I guess you could say, of a lore compared to the other two gods, but he's by no means any less important. In fact, he's considered the most active of the three as the pantheon god of the warriors of Kislev. Many kind of offer up prayers to the thunder god before going into battle. Even particularly renowned warriors kind of weave threads of silver, the god's preferred metal, in their beard as a veneration and thanks to the Thunder King. That's actually kind of important to note. Most of these gods have a metal associated with them, or some sort of natural occurring material, whatever the hell it is. Tor's is silver, Dazh's is obviously gold, so you've got that. Mini digression. Now there's no splitting hairs here, guys. Tor is clearly Thor. Thor is actually sometimes called Tor by certain sources in our own Norse mythology. And he wields a mighty axe with kind of an oaken haft that splits the skies every time there is a crack of lightning followed by a boom of thunder that echoes across the lands of Kislev. So there's not a ton of mystique to the thunder god. In fact, it's all overly simple. His temples are nestled at the highest point of his hills and mountains, especially the ones that dot the World's Edge Mountains, and his priests offer up prayers during raging thunderstorms rather than actual dedicated holy days. So it's a little bit more of a consistent, maybe not consistent, but a perpetual worship to Tor. There's no set holy days where people kind of have these grand pyres with these huge donations and these huge sacrifices to the gods like they do for Dazh. Dazh kind of has these really crazy, elaborate holy day celebrations, which plays very heavily into Dazh's not mechanics, but I guess role. But the kind of nifty thing about Tor is that his name is bandied about a lot, much in the same way we use the exclamation of like Jesus Christ or oh my God. Kislevites would say T Tor or Tai Tor, which just translates to by Tor, because you know, changing one letter is a translation, but that's neither here nor there. And it's an exclamation of disbelief typically. Then there's the curse of Dor Tor, which translates to Tor's bolt, an intended target for the god of thunder's wrath. To further simplify things, there's only one stricture for Tor, and it's pretty simple too. Don't stand under a tree during a thunderstorm. You know, that's like a basic principle of life taught at an early age when you're in diapers or something like that, because babies love to crawl under trees during thunderstorms. Fact of life. Fight you if you argue with that. Unfortunately though, Tor's lore of magic is actually pretty boring. Mainly kind of like thunderbolts and, you know, strike people, or this is a weird one, like amplify the sounds of combat. Everything's very heavily circumstantial roleplay abilities that I could see coming in handy, but nothing that overly translates to Total War Warhammer, outside of maybe a clone of the Lore of Heavens, which, I mean, that's actually kind of a good idea. You know, it might be CA's way of giving these three lores to Kislev: Heavens, Fire, and Wild. Who knows? But I'd love to see them run with this and make some kind of custom lores that maybe are copies of Heavens, Fire, and Wild, but with maybe a little bit more of a twist to it. Maybe that's how they're going to do it, because the Kislev isn't known far and wide for their ability to do anything other than the lore of ice. So this could be their way of kind of combating that with the priests of each respective god. Well, that brings us to the end of our foray down the major gods of the Kislevite Pantheon. And there are some minor gods. There's Kalita, the goddess of trade, Salyak, the goddess of healing, and the Ancient Widow, who is a spirit that essentially kind of helped the first Kislevite people establish their civilization in Kislev Actual. But they don't have the level of lore fleshed out like these three do, and their worship is rather subdued and not on a wider scale as, again, these three are. Also, they bear a lot of resemblance to Empire gods, leading some to believe that they're the same gods, just with a different name kind of changed to the vernacular of the Kislev language. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on the Kislev gods, and hopefully they play a heavy influence in Total War Warhammer 3's, maybe the Rite system, or maybe the Rite of Ursin, giving bonuses to priests of Ulrich, or Bearcav, or the Sons of Ursus, who we will all talk about, or even the Rite of Dazh, which might increase income from certain buildings and trade, and maybe even growth across the region, or the Rite of Tor, which fills the landscape with thunderstorms that hinder enemy movement and maybe cause attrition. But in the same way we have, the Tomb King Rite that covers the land in sandstorms. There's so many options. Who knows? Next up, we'll discuss each and every unit in the Kislev roster, as well as the lore of the land itself. And look for that on the horizon in the next few days here, guys. But as always, thanks so much for watching. Please like and comment if you enjoyed this video. Let me know some other gods you'd like to know about, or maybe you know something I didn't cover. Always love to hear from y'all. Don't forget to subscribe, check out the Patreon, maybe stalk me, who knows. Either way, have a good one, guys, and take care.